The year was 49 BCE. Rome was sick. The Senate bickered while the provinces burned. Grain shipments faltered, veterans rioted, and the streets of the city choked on crime. Rome's elite feuded with words and knives, using private armies and public spectacles to cling to crumbling prestige. Yet amid this, one man returned from the north with thunder in his name and loyalty in his legions: Gaius Julius Caesar. After 8 years of conquest in Gaul, he did not crawl back for favors. He marched with purpose. Caesar stood at the Rubicon, a shallow river by geography, but deep by law. Generals were forbidden to cross it with troops. Doing so meant civil war. And yet, on that cold January night, Caesar didn't hesitate. "Alia iacta est," he said. "The die is cast." When he crossed, it wasn't just a challenge to Pompey and the Senate. It was an invitation to Rome itself. Choose order or chaos. His army was loyal, hardened by blood and winter. His enemies were fractured. Pompey fled east. The Senate scattered. Rome didn't resist. It opened its gates. To many citizens, Caesar's arrival wasn't a coup. It was salvation. The civil wars had ground down every pillar of the old republic. Farmers were ruined, urban mobs were starved, and the Senate had become a playground for the rich. Caesar fed the people. He canceled debts. He restored grain supplies. He didn't have to seize power. People handed it to him. They begged for it, not out of love, but out of desperation. When he was named dictator in 49 BCE, it was supposed to be temporary, a year to clean up the crisis. But the crisis didn't end. One war led to another, first against Pompey, then against the remnants of the senatorial elite. Caesar fought in Spain, Greece, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. Each victory brought more devotion from his men, more admiration from the public, and more fear from the Senate. He wasn't just winning battles. He was reshaping the republic into something personal. In 46 BCE, he returned victorious. The Senate declared him dictator again, this time for 10 years. Then, just a year later, for life. Statues of him rose in temples. His face appeared on coins, unheard of in a republic. He dressed in purple, wore laurel crowns, and received offerings like a god. People applauded in the streets. Priests sang hymns to him. They didn't see a tyrant. They saw a man who made Rome function again. He passed laws that fed the hungry, granted citizenship, and resettled veterans in colonies. The Senate chamber, once a battlefield of competing egos, now echoed with rubber-stamped decrees. Caesar placed allies in key positions, expanded the number of senators to dilute old power blocks, and stacked the bureaucracy with loyalists. To his followers, he brought peace. To his enemies, he erased the republic by inches. And yet, he never called himself king. When offered a crown in public by Mark Antony, he refused it, not once, but 3 times. It wasn't the title he needed. It was the control. Caesar was no fool. He knew Rome hated monarchy, but he also knew power wasn't held by words. It was held by gratitude, fear, and results. And in that, he delivered. The republic gasped its last while the people cheered. But beneath the cheers were murmurs. Senators who once called him savior now whispered in shadows. Some still hoped to limit his rise. Others just hoped to survive it. Yet none could deny one truth. Caesar hadn't taken power. He had been asked to take it, over and over again. And now, with Rome secure, the real question began to grow. Would he ever get back? The Senate chamber, once the symbolic heart of Roman freedom, now felt like a theater of submission. After Caesar's return from Africa and his unprecedented quadruple triumph, he strutted through the halls not as an equal among senators, but as a man above them. He no longer waited to be asked, he instructed. The purple robes, the golden chair, the laurel wreath, it was not just the dress of a general. It was the attire of a monarch. And even if Caesar refused the crown in public, few doubted anymore that he ruled as one. He passed laws unilaterally. He appointed magistrates without elections. The tribunes, once protectors of the people, echoed his will. Even the consulship, once the republic's highest office, became just another title he held concurrently with others. The Senate swelled, not with old patricians, but with Gallic nobles, loyal soldiers, provincial administrators. Caesar made room for them by expanding the Senate's size to 900. In name, it was inclusive. In practice, it was dilution. The old aristocracy's votes meant less. Their traditions less. They sat and watched the forum become his stage. It wasn't just political. It was personal. Caesar changed how men addressed him. Dominus, master. Imperator, commander. Statues of him were placed next to the gods. His birthday was declared a public holiday. Priests were ordered to tend to his cult. A golden throne was placed in the Senate for him to sit upon, and a temple to his clementia, his mercy, was erected near the forum. He was given veto power over nearly everything. What was once a republic was now orbiting around a single gravitational center. And the senators, what could they do? Many had supported Pompey and lived in exile or disgrace. Others owed their offices to Caesar's favor. Few wanted another civil war. Most preferred relevance over resistance. So they clapped when he spoke. They stood when he entered. They passed whatever decrees his scribes drafted. Some out of fear, others out of habit, a few even out of admiration. But admiration quickly curdled into alarm. The more Caesar centralized authority, the more he made the Senate irrelevant. Meetings grew shorter, debates fewer, decisions predetermined. In private, old families like the Junii, the Cassii, the Brutii met and whispered, was this still a republic? Was this the future of Rome? One man with all the power, and a chorus of senators pretending it was constitutional? The moment that shifted whispers into dread came in early 44 BCE. Caesar accepted the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. Not just for 10 years, not just for crisis, forever. A republic born in the overthrow of kings now lived under a man who could not be removed. It was no longer theory. It was reality. Caesar was not a transitional leader. He was the government. Then came the Lupercalia festival, a public celebration, crowded and chaotic. In front of the people, Mark Antony approached Caesar and offered him a diadem, a royal crown. Caesar waved it away. Cheers. Antony offered it again. Another refusal. But to those watching closely, the theater was revealing. Antony was testing the waters, and Caesar was watching the crowd, not to reject monarchy, but to measure how soon he could claim it. To the public, the refusal proved Caesar's humility. But to the senators who had fought and bled for the republic's survival, it was a warning flare. The line had been crossed, not just legally, but symbolically. Rome had once exiled kings for tyranny. Now it celebrated a man who ruled like one. Every festival, every statue, every decree without debate, they all confirmed the same truth. The republic was dying, not with a sword, but with applause. Those who called Caesar a savior now feared his permanence. Even men who once supported him began to wonder what would happen after him. He had no legitimate heir. He had no plan for succession. If he died suddenly, would another war follow? If he lived forever, would Rome ever be free again? He had created order, but it was an order built on his presence alone. The Senate was no longer debating policy. It was calculating its survival. Senators began to fear that history would remember them not as statesmen, but as cowards. That they would be blamed for watching liberty die in silence. That they would be the generation that surrendered Rome. And worst of all, some began to suspect that Caesar would soon declare himself king, not just in effect, but in name. When word spread that he planned to leave Rome in March to launch a campaign against Parthia, alarm became panic. Because once he conquered another empire, who could oppose him? Who could restrain him? What laws would matter? The Senate had two choices: act now or be irrelevant forever. Marcus Junius Brutus was not a man drawn easily to conspiracy. He was the kind of Roman others pointed to as a living reminder of the Republic's ideals. Stoic, rational, descended from the very Brutus who helped drive out Rome's last king centuries earlier. His bloodline was not just ancient, it was symbolic. For years, people said that if tyranny ever returned, a Brutus would rise to end it. Now the city looked to him with expectation and fear. But the truth was more tangled. Brutus was not some aloof moralist untouched by power. He had once taken up arms against Caesar, siding with Pompey during the early years of the Civil War. He fought at Pharsalus in 48 BCE against Caesar directly. But Caesar, victorious, had pardoned him. Not only pardoned, he embraced him, brought him into his inner circle, promoted him, trusted him. Caesar had even appointed Brutus as praetor for 44 BCE, a prestigious post second only to consul. He dined with him. He praised him publicly. To many, it looked like Caesar saw Brutus as a political son, perhaps more. There were rumors that Brutus might even be Caesar's biological child. His mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's mistress for decades. Their affair was no secret, and Caesar often showed unusual favor to her family. Whether or not the rumor was true, the emotional weight it carried was real. It made Caesar's trust in Brutus feel personal, and it made Brutus' position unbearable, because by 44 BCE, Brutus had become the symbol of everything that was at stake. If even he stood silent while Caesar crowned himself king, then what hope was left? What dignity remained in the Senate? Brutus was not alone in feeling the pull of duty. Gaius Cassius Longinus, another senator, had also fought against Caesar and been pardoned. But unlike Brutus, Cassius never forgave the defeat. He was sharp, bitter, and driven. And in Caesar's climb, he saw nothing but monarchy disguised as mercy. It was Cassius who first whispered the idea. Not abstract resistance, not speeches or petitions. Action, removal, assassination. And as more senators came into the circle, some motivated by fear, others by principle, others by bruised ego, a plan began to take shape. Decimus Brutus, another of Caesar's confidants, joined. So did Trebonius, Ligarius, and over 50 others. The conspiracy swelled quietly, a mix of old patricians and recent appointees, all bound by the same fear. If Caesar left for Parthia in March, he would return as a god. There would be no second chance. But there was still Brutus. He was the key, not because they needed his sword, but because they needed his name. Without Brutus, it would look like a coup. With him, it could be framed as justice. Cassius knew this. So did the others. They courted him, pleaded with him, showed him Caesar's increasingly godlike titles, his public arrogance, his disregard for the Senate. Brutus hesitated. He had honor, but he also had affection. Caesar had saved him. Caesar had trusted him. For weeks, he wavered. But the final push came when Caesar's image began appearing in temples alongside those of gods, when his statue stood next to Quirinus, the deified Romulus. It was not enough to refuse a crown in public if every gesture said otherwise. Brutus made his choice. He would not be the man who watched the Republic die in silence. The plan was dangerous, but simple. Strike when Caesar was unguarded. And there was only one place in Rome where that could happen: the Senate. Caesar had dismissed his bodyguards months earlier, perhaps believing his popularity was protection enough. He often walked to the Senate alone, unarmored, flanked only by aides. There, surrounded by tradition and law, the conspirators would act. They chose the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE. On that day, Caesar was scheduled to attend a Senate session at the Theater of Pompey. It was not the usual curia, which was being renovated, but a temporary location, lavish and open. The symbolism was thick. Caesar would die beneath a statue of Pompey, the rival he had defeated, the last man who truly challenged him. Each conspirator had a role. Some would distract him. Others would surround him. The first wound would not be mortal. It would be the signal. They didn't plan to escape. They expected to be hailed as saviors. They imagined themselves walking out of the Senate to cheers. Yet the night before the Ides, omens weighed heavily. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, dreamed of his murder. She begged him not to go. A soothsayer warned him again, beware the Ides of March. Even his friends urged caution, but Caesar mocked the warnings. The Ides have come, he said as he passed the seer. Aye, the man replied, but not gone. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar hesitated. For a brief moment, it seemed he might stay home. But Decimus Brutus, trusted by Caesar, came and urged him to attend. He spun the hesitation as cowardice, unbecoming of a man so adored. Caesar agreed. He left for the Senate, unaware that almost every man awaiting him carried a blade. The theater of Pompey was already stirring when Caesar arrived, late morning, on the Ides of March. Senators milled beneath the marble porticos and along the colonnades. Shadows of the statue-lined gallery flickered across the floor as sunlight pierced the atrium's open roof. No horns, no guards, no escort. Caesar entered as he often did, casually, confidently, with his papers in hand and purpose in his step. But what he didn't see was the tension in the eyes that greeted him. Too many senators were present. Too few were speaking. The air was too still. He walked toward the curved stone steps that led to his gilded chair, his throne, some called it. Trebonius approached first, drawing him aside with quiet words. It was a practiced distraction, keeping Mark Antony away from the chamber. Trebonius had been a general, a consul. His request seemed natural. Caesar listened. Then came a circle. They converged around him like friends eager to speak, but their bodies formed a cage. Casca was closest. He reached for Caesar's toga, as if requesting a word. But his grip tightened. His hand pulled sharply. Caesar, startled, turned to him. In that moment, Casca drew a blade from beneath his robes and struck. The first cut hit Caesar's shoulder, shallow but shocking. He spun in confusion, shouting, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" But Casca hesitated. His blow had failed. Then others moved. Cassius drove his dagger into Caesar's ribs. Decimus Brutus slashed his thigh. One by one, they closed in, blades drawn, faces clenched, bodies pressing inward. It was not quick. It was not clean. 23 wounds were delivered in total, though only one, a blow to the chest, was truly fatal. Caesar tried to fight back, grabbing arms, dodging slashes. But in that chaos, shouting blood, steel clanging off bone, his struggle slowed. Then he saw Brutus. Their eyes met, and there it was, the betrayal that history would never forget. "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" Some said he whispered it. Others said he said nothing at all. But the meaning was written across his face. In Brutus, Caesar saw not just a friend. He saw the end. His resistance faltered. He stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his head. Dignity, even in death. Then he collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, dying beneath the marble image of the man he had once defeated to claim his power. Blood pooled across the tiles. Senators stumbled away, shocked by the carnage. Their hands were cut, their robes stained. The marble floor was a mess of footprints and crimson streaks. The Senate chamber fell silent. No trumpets, no cheers, no crowds rushing forward. For a moment, the killers stood alone with their act, unsure of what came next. They had expected applause. They received horror. Word spread faster than any plan they had made. By midday, the city was in a panic. Shops closed. Markets emptied. People ran through the streets, shouting conflicting rumors. Caesar lived. Caesar was dead. Civil war had returned. Women wept in the forums. Men armed themselves. The conspirators had not secured the city. They had no army. They had only hope. And now that hope looked fragile. Mark Antony, warned by Trebonius but not restrained for long, learned of the assassination and fled. He feared being the next target. But quickly, he realized no purge had followed. The conspirators had acted without coordination. No leaders were arrested. No supporters of Caesar were hunted. It was as if the murder had no plan beyond the knife. Brutus and Cassius addressed the Senate the next day. They did not run. They presented themselves as liberators, defenders of the Republic, heirs to the founders who expelled kings. They argued that Caesar had taken too much, ruled too long, destroyed too many customs. His death, they said, restored Rome's liberty. But the people did not agree. They had not seen Caesar as a tyrant. They had seen him as their protector. The man who brought food, jobs, laws, colonies. The man who pardoned enemies. Who gave money to soldiers, land to veterans, grain to the hungry. The man who stabilized a broken world. To the masses, his killers were not heroes. They were murderers. Then came the funeral. Mark Antony, seizing the moment, read Caesar's will aloud in the forum. Every citizen received a monetary gift, 75 denarii per person. Caesar had also left his gardens to the public, turning personal estates into shared sanctuaries. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a final speech from the grave. Antony's eulogy followed, not restrained or ceremonial, but electric with grief and fury. He raised Caesar's bloodied toga, pierced with dagger holes. He showed the body, the wounds, the reality of the murder. His words stoked anger. His gestures poured oil on flame. The crowd, already restless, turned violent. They rioted. They burned. They stormed the homes of the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled the city under guard. The funeral pyre became a flashpoint, a roaring blaze that lit the beginning of something worse than tyranny. Chaos. Caesar was dead, but the Republic was not restored. Instead, Rome stood on the edge of civil war once again. The murder had been meant to stop one man from seizing total power, but it unchained the ambitions of many. The Senate was paralyzed. The people were enraged. The assassins, believing themselves saviors, now moved like fugitives, hiding or fleeing altogether. Rome did not rise in chorus to thank them. It recoiled. It feared what would come next. Caesar had been a singular authority. In his absence, a vacuum opened, and power, in Rome, was never left unclaimed. Mark Antony acted first. He had been Caesar's co-consul, his closest political ally, and now stood at the head of the Caesarian faction. He had Caesar's papers, his seal, his knowledge of pending legislation. Most importantly, he had the soldiers, not legions, yet but loyal veterans still in the city, still grateful to Caesar, still furious. Antony did not declare war on the assassins, not immediately. He played shrewdly, appealing to unity, promising peace. But behind the words, he consolidated control. He arranged votes. He maneuvered his rivals. He began securing key provinces for himself. But Antony was not the only heir to Caesar's power. From across the sea came a new name, Octavian. Barely 19 years old, grandnephew of Caesar, and recently adopted by him by testament. He was not a soldier. He was not yet a senator. He was a boy, frail and bookish. But he bore a name that now meant everything, Gaius Julius Caesar. And with that name came a following. When Octavian landed in Italy, he did not swagger. He spoke carefully, offered clemency, vowed loyalty to Caesar's memory. Veterans listened. Towns welcomed him. The Senate, skeptical, watched as this young man, now styling himself Caesar's son, began gathering troops. He promised to avenge the Ides of March. He promised to punish the assassins. He promised to restore order. Cassius and Brutus, watching from exile in the east, saw the danger. Their hope had been for the Republic's restoration through moral example. But morals could not compete with money, memory, and fear. They began raising their own forces, gathering support among the governors of Syria, Macedonia, and Asia. Rome was heading not toward renewal, but toward reckoning. In the west, Antony moved to claim Cisalpine Gaul, then held by Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators. It was a direct challenge. Octavian, still legally powerless, sided with the Senate to oppose Antony. Together with the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, Octavian marched north. In 43 BCE, at the Battle of Mutina, Antony was defeated. The consuls died in battle, but Octavian stood victorious. Rome rejoiced briefly, but then came Octavian's demand. He wanted consulship immediately, despite being underage and unqualified. The Senate resisted. Octavian brought his legions to Rome, not as a rebel, but as a restorer. He entered the city and claimed the office by force. It was no longer about age or law. It was about control. The Senate had lost its grip entirely. Then came the political masterstroke. Octavian made peace with Antony and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's former master of cavalry. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, an official, legally sanctioned three-man dictatorship. It was not an alliance of trust. It was an alliance of necessity. Their first act, vengeance. They issued proscriptions, a list of enemies to be executed and their properties seized. Names appeared on walls. Bounties were paid. Rome descended into blood. Cicero, the Republic's great orator and longtime opponent of Caesar, was among the most famous victims. He was hunted, captured, and killed. His hands and head were displayed in the Forum. His voice, once the Senate's conscience, was silenced forever. Meanwhile, in the East, Brutus and Cassius built their power. They controlled legions, gold, entire provinces. They issued coins calling themselves liberatores. They promised to restore Rome, still believing that the Republic could be rebuilt through arms. But time was against them. The people remembered Caesar, not the Senate. The veterans remembered land, not laws. The Republic was a memory, not a cause. In 42 BCE, the final reckoning came at Philippi. Brutus and Cassius faced Octavian and Antony. 2 battles followed. In the first, Cassius, mistakenly believing Brutus had been defeated, committed suicide. In the second, Brutus was routed and took his own life. The last defenders of the Republic fell not by enemy hands, but by despair. Their army collapsed. Their dream died. Octavian and Antony now stood unchallenged. The Republic, already a corpse in Caesar's day, was buried in the Macedonian soil. What followed was not peace, but division. Octavian took the west, Antony the east, and Lepidus was soon marginalized. The triumvirate unraveled. Conflict loomed again, but one thing was now certain. Caesar's death had not saved the Republic. It had killed it. In trying to prevent a king, the conspirators had paved the road for an emperor. In stabbing Caesar, they had severed the Republic's last vein of unity. What rose in its place would not be liberty, but empire. The blood on the Senate floor had long dried, but the wounds it opened never closed. The death of Julius Caesar was meant to halt the march of monarchy, yet it accelerated it. And now, as the smoke cleared from Philippi and the last cries of the Republic's defenders faded, Rome was not delivered from tyranny. It was delivered into the hands of 2 survivors locked in a slow, grinding collision, Mark Antony and Octavian. What had once been an uneasy partnership now turned into a contest of dominance. Antony ruled the East, wealthier, older, more urbane, centered around Alexandria and its queen, Cleopatra. Octavian controlled the West, Rome itself, the Senate, the Italian heartland, and most crucially, the loyalty of veterans and the Roman people. Between them, the Mediterranean world trembled, not with hope, but with dread of the inevitable. Octavian moved first, not with armies, but with propaganda. He painted Antony as a traitor to Roman values, as a man bewitched by the East, by Cleopatra, by luxury, excess, and foreign gods. Rome, Octavian insisted, was not ruled from Alexandria. Rome belonged to Italians, to Romans, to traditions, even if those traditions were hollowed out by force. Slowly, methodically, Octavian poisoned Antony's image. He didn't attack Egypt. He attacked Antony's identity. At the same time, he reshaped his own. Octavian, once the frail boy of 19, now stood as Caesar's true heir. He adopted the name Caesar formally, called himself Divi Filius, son of the deified one. After Caesar's official deification by the Senate, Octavian claimed divine lineage. He was not just avenging his adoptive father. He was continuing his destiny. Temples went up. Coins bore his face. Legions swore loyalty to him personally. Antony tried to match him. He had power, money, armies. But he made critical missteps. His affair with Cleopatra, already scandalous to Roman conservatives, grew into a full political alliance. He fathered children with her, gave them eastern territories, and, most unforgivably, named Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, as a legitimate heir. To Octavian, this was not just insult. It was challenge. Rome seethed. To many, Antony now seemed foreign, soft, compromised. In 32 BCE, Octavian took a final step. he seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and read it publicly. In it, Antony acknowledged Caesarion, pledged land to Cleopatra's children, and asked to be buried in Egypt. It was political suicide. Octavian called him a traitor. The Senate, under pressure, declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. A war for Roman purity, a war against Eastern seduction. But everyone knew it was a war against Antony. The final clash came at sea. Actium, 31 BC, the Ionian coast. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, strong, well-equipped, numerically superior, faced Octavian's forces, led by his admiral Agrippa. But Antony's command was divided, his soldiers uncertain, his leadership clouded by personal entanglement. Cleopatra was on the water, commanding her own ships. Midway through the battle, as confusion swirled, she broke from the fight and fled. Antony followed. His fleet, disoriented and leaderless, crumbled. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a collapse. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Octavian followed, slow and deliberate. When he reached Alexandria, the city resisted briefly, then surrendered. Antony, cornered, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, soon after, famously took her own life, though exactly how remains debated. Poison, snakebite, dagger, it didn't matter. What mattered was that both were gone. Octavian stood alone. He executed Caesarion. No rivals. No threats. Lepidus had already been sidelined. Antony was dead. Brutus and Cassius were long in the grave. Octavian returned to Rome as master of everything. But he was careful. He did not call himself king. He learned from Caesar's fate. In 27 BCE, he performed a brilliant act of political theater. He offered to resign all power to restore the Republic. The Senate, stacked with his loyalists, refused. They granted him new titles, Augustus, the revered one, and Princeps, first citizen. Not monarch, but something higher than consul, higher than senator. He accepted. Humble, obedient, permanent. This was no republic. It was empire in all but name. Augustus controlled the army, the treasury, the provinces. He appointed magistrates. He oversaw foreign affairs. His image adorned temples. But legally, the Senate still existed. Elections still happened. Laws still passed. It was a facade, and everyone played along. Rome was exhausted. It wanted peace. It wanted order. Augustus delivered it for now. What began with a murder in the Senate ended with a throne without a crown. The conspirators had feared a tyrant. Instead, they cleared the path for a dynasty. Augustus would rule for over 4 decades. After him, emperors would follow, some noble, some monstrous, but all built on the ruins of a republic stabbed 23 times on a March morning. The ashes of Caesar's pyre had cooled, but the fire it sparked reshaped the world. As Augustus consolidated power, what had once been a republic of senators and magistrates now pulsed to the beat of a single will. Laws were still passed, but only with approval. Elections occurred, but only as formalities. Augustus was careful not to call himself king, but he lived in the Palatine Palace, had command over the army, and wore the moral authority of a god's heir. Rome had changed, fundamentally and irrevocably, but not everyone grasped how deep that change ran. The assassins, Brutus, Cassius, and their co-conspirators, had believed that by removing Caesar, they were halting monarchy's rise. But their knife did not prevent autocracy. It accelerated it. And now, Augustus ruled more completely than Caesar ever had, not through crisis or dictatorship, but through permanence and illusion. He held titles, not thrones, received honors, not crowns. But everyone knew his word was law. Rome had not become free. It had become stable. And the people, after decades of civil war, preferred it that way. Still, the memory of the Ides of March lingered, twisted, controversial, unresolved. Across taverns and temples, markets and military camps, Romans whispered conflicting truths. Was Caesar a would-be king or a misunderstood reformer? Were the assassins defenders of liberty or jealous nobles clinging to fading power? The answers shifted with the speaker, the audience, and the times. The popular classes, the plebeians, the veterans, the provincials, largely idolized Caesar. To them, he had been a man of action, a giver of land, a builder of peace. They remembered the grain subsidies, the debt reforms, the colonies abroad where families could start new. His death had felt like a theft, and they had shown their outrage in the streets. Their mourning had shaped the political wind that blew Octavian to dominance. The senatorial elite, those who survived, never forgot the sting of humiliation. The Republic had been their domain, their heritage, their justification for rule. Caesar had slashed their ranks, diluted their privileges, insulted their traditions with every bypassed election and ignored veto. But they had failed to understand something vital. They no longer commanded loyalty. Their authority was abstract. Caesar's was tangible. And after his death, the Senate's moral claim to power was gone. They had killed a man, but they could not resurrect their system. Those who had wielded the daggers, the so-called liberators, fared little better in death than they had in life. Brutus, in his final moments at Philippi, had offered no triumphal speech, just a quiet end, a sword turned inward, a whispered hope that the Republic might yet outlive him. But the Republic did not. His name became complicated, a symbol of resistance to tyranny for some, a byword for betrayal for others. Et2, Brute, was immortal, not because it proved treachery, but because it made betrayal feel intimate. Caesar had fallen not just to enemies, but to someone he loved. Cassius died, believing the cause was lost, mistakenly, thinking Brutus had fallen before him. He had plotted, planned, recruited with surgical efficiency, but he hadn't foreseen that removing Caesar wouldn't be enough. The disease ran deeper. The Republic needed not just defenders, but believers. And by 42 BCE, almost no one believed anymore. Their fellow conspirators scattered, died, or faded into irrelevance. Some tried to plead their cause in exile. Others simply vanished. Few monuments were ever raised for them. The new regime, under Augustus, had no need for martyrs to old ideals. Instead, Caesar became legend. His image appeared in temples, his name invoked in ceremonies. His heir called himself Caesar Augustus, then the next took the name, and the next. Caesar stopped being a surname. It became a title, a role, a symbol of supreme command. Even centuries later, emperors across the world, Tsars in Russia, Kaisers in Germany, would trace their titles back to him. The man the conspirators tried to erase had become eternal. Rome itself followed suit. It no longer dreamed of a Senate-led government. It dreamed of strong rulers, glorious campaigns, divine favor. The Republic was taught in schools, quoted in rhetoric, praised in literature, but not practiced in law. The facade of senatorial governance remained, but the spirit was gone. Empire was the reality. And yet, the moral question never disappeared. Every generation asked it anew. What if Brutus had not lifted his blade? What if Caesar had never crossed the Rubicon? What if Rome had chosen law over loyalty, restraint over reverence? Would the Republic have survived? Or was it already dead, rotted by corruption, inequality, and inertia before Caesar ever marched? The murder had not been an isolated act. It was a mirror. It showed Rome what it had become, a state too broken to share power, too hungry for heroes, too blind to see that the Republic's corpse was already cold. The assassins were not villains or saviors. They were men of a dying age, trying to pull the past back into place with bloodied hands. Octavian ruled, and with each passing year the memory of Caesar's death became less an event and more a myth. The Republic that Brutus and Cassius had fought to preserve survived only in name. The Senate still convened, magistrates still took office, laws were still passed with ritual and form, but the outcomes were never in doubt. Power had narrowed to one man. Elections were managed. Debate was permitted only within the lines of flattery. And yet, the city remained calm. The empire expanded. The people were fed. For many Romans, that was enough. But the judgment of history is never so simple. Brutus and Cassius did not live to explain themselves. Their voices died with them at Philippi. What survived were the narratives written by others, supporters of Augustus, apologists for empire, chroniclers loyal to stability over principle. In those pages, the conspirators were reduced to archetypes, proud nobles clinging to a vanished past, killers of a generous leader, misguided patriots who mistook Caesar's popularity for tyranny. Their motivations were questioned, their actions criticized, their cause defeated. Yet they were not forgotten. Every time a ruler overreached, Brutus returned. Every time a tyrant was challenged, his name echoed. During the Roman Empire's worst moments, under Nero, under Caligula, under Domitian, senators invoked Brutus in whispers. They remembered what it had once meant to oppose unchecked rule. They remembered that the Republic had fallen not by invasion or collapse, but by consent, given to Caesar, handed to Augustus, cemented by blood and silence. Later emperors, more self-aware, tried to distance themselves from Caesar's example. Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. These so-called good emperors sought legitimacy not through fear, but through merit. They praised the Republic even as they ruled without it. They restored some senatorial dignity, allowed limited criticism, pretended the old laws still meant something. But the structure of empire remained intact. And still, Brutus lingered. In literature, in theater, in art, his figure appeared again and again. Shakespeare, writing in a world far removed from Rome, captured the emotional ambiguity. Brutus loved Caesar, but loved Rome more. That line, that idea became timeless. It posed the eternal question, what do you do when loyalty and principle collide? When a friend becomes a threat? When the system itself is the victim? In schools across the empire, children read Livy and Cicero. They learned about the Republic as a noble ideal, even if they lived under emperors. They memorized the deeds of Cincinnatus, the restraint of Scipio, the virtue of the Senate. They were taught to revere what no longer existed. And in that contradiction, Brutus became not just a man, but a question. Was he a patriot, a defender of liberty, or a fool who misunderstood his time? A killer blinded by nostalgia, unable to see that Caesar's rise had been earned, not stolen? Even among later revolutionaries, centuries after the last Roman emperor had fallen, his story lived on. In Renaissance Italy, thinkers looked back to the Roman Republic as the ideal state. In the French Revolution, Brutus was celebrated as a model of civic virtue. In America's founding, the Senate was reborn in name, and the memory of Rome's collapse was invoked as a warning against tyranny. And in each of these movements, the same dilemma emerged. Is stability more important than freedom? Is power safer in one hand or in many? That was the choice Brutus had faced, and it remains the choice every republic must reckon with. Because Caesar did not come from nowhere. He was the product of dysfunction, of a Senate paralyzed by class warfare, of a state that exploited provinces but failed to govern them, of an elite that hoarded power but could not wield it. He filled a vacuum, and for a time, he made things work. So the question is not simply whether it was right to kill Caesar. It's whether it was already too late. The men who stabbed him believed they were saving something. But the people who watched it happen saw something else. The last hope extinguished. The last leader with a vision brought down by those who had none. And in the chaos that followed, Rome made its final choice, not for freedom, but for control. Brutus and Cassius were hunted. Octavian rose. Augustus reigned. The emperors followed. But the debate never ended. It lives in every democracy, every autocracy, every generation that wonders how to stop a tyrant, or whether they even want to. Because in the end, it was not the dagger that killed the Republic. It was the applause that followed.